Hello, and welcome to this year's HaAtzmaut lecture. Once again, I decided to pre-record it. Hopefully in another year we will be able to do this live. This year's chosen topic is the life and very strange writings of Moses Hess, whom I've called a communist Zionist, Moses Hess and Rome to Jerusalem, which is his Zionist work. There's a source pack that comes with this shiur of some 13 pages. It looks like this. It will be available from a link that you can read in the YouTube description. Please do download it and use it as part of this lecture. There's far too much text to read here. That's not the intention. I'm going to read selections from the text and hope the rest of it will be useful and of general interest. Moses Hess, Section A. Here are some images of Hess, what appears to be a well-known painting of him from 1845, when he would have been in his early 30s, you can see from the timeline. A later image that appears in many descriptions. And finally, although he was originally buried in Cologne in 1875, he was reinterred in 1961 in the Kinneret Cemetery, and his grave is there to be seen. So who was this Moses Hess? You can see a timeline which I've created. Born in 1812 in Bonn. Bonn was one of those French places that, while we know it to be in Germany, was formerly in France. He was called Moïse, sometimes known as Moritz as well. And you can see he comes from a rabbinic background, although we will discover that his views evolve and he is pretty anti-religious. He's the grandson of David Tebli Hess, the chief rabbi of Mannheim. That's his father. And Jeanette is his mother from the family Floersheim, and you can see that she was the daughter of a rabbi too. They moved to Cologne as a family. Father runs a business, and they leave Moses behind in Bonn. When his mother dies when he is a teenager, Hess moves to Cologne to be with his father. So he has a strange upbringing, and you can see various details of his life. He moves around quite a lot. He begins to publish in his 20s, and we'll touch briefly on these works: A Holy History of Mankind by a young disciple of Spinoza, The European Triarchy. And by his 30s, he is a committed communist and becomes known for his views in this area, and has a contentious and difficult relationship with Marx. By early 1850s, his father has died, and he marries a Catholic woman with whom he's been living for years but doesn't seem to have been able to marry, perhaps while his father was still alive. In 1862, when he's 50, he publishes the work Rome and Jerusalem, which will be the focus of this shiur, and continues to work to move around, spreading Zionist and communist ideas. He's eventually expelled from France, although returns and dies in Paris in 1875. I divided the text into sections, a little bit here about his upbringing and development. These ones are worth working. These are from his own writings, and give an insight into what his thinking is when he is a young man. So from his diary in 1836, when Hess would have been 24, he says, "In the Jewish quarter I was born and educated until my 15th year. They tried to beat the Talmud into me." And we understand, and you'll see shortly, that Hess had a very traditional Talmudic education. My teachers were inhuman beings. My colleagues were bad company, inducing me to secret sins. My body was frail, my spirit raw. Besides the Talmud, I also took private lessons in German and French. Then I entered my adolescence. I wanted to join my father in his business, to be near to him. That's when he moved to Cologne. But Providence willed it differently. My glowing love was returned with what seemed a coldness which broke my heart. So his mother dies young, and he has a very cold, distant relationship with his father. And he hates his teachers. My interest in business life was rejected. I was supposed to devote myself only to the Talmud, but the Talmud utterly repelled me. Though I was still a pious Jew boy, not sure about the translation there, but it's obviously written in German, I wanted to satisfy my craving to be active, to do something. This craving looked for a sphere for itself because none offered it. And he already is discussing his need to be an activist, which he certainly becomes later in life. I did not want to be a good-for-nothing, and therefore I became a writer. Next page, a writer. What education did I receive? None. Where did I study? Nowhere. What did I study? It does not matter. I nonetheless became a writer immediately because I wrote more than I have ever read. Hence I thought more than I had food for thought. It is perhaps remarkable that as soon as the crisis of my soul started, the crisis of my body disappeared. During the period I'm talking about, I was as virtuous as Joseph. Not one lurid fantasy did I keep, something quite phenomenal for a youngster. In the interests of good taste, I will omit reading the next bit, which you can read for yourself. Once I started my spiritual journey, I stopped being unclean. My main problem was naturally religion, and he has a very conflicted relationship with Judaism and his clearly strictly orthodox background. From it, I moved later onto the principle of ethics, and this is where you see he becomes a Spinozan. He is a devoted student and disciple of Spinoza, who appears to have been the strongest influence, that he believes that one can take the particularity of Judaism and expand it into a kind of universal ethic in a kind of Spinoza style. First to be examined was my positive religion, Judaism. It collapsed. So I wanted to base myself on natural religion, but my agony was so great that this foundation also collapsed before my eyes. Nothing remained. I was the most miserable person in the world. I became an atheist. The world became a burden and a curse to me. I looked at it as a cadaver. Nature appeared to me as chaos without order. About history, I have not yet heard. I could not accept this situation. I worked without rest to rediscover my God whom I had lost. Nor could I remain a skeptic for the rest of my life. I had to have a God. And I did find him after a long search, after a terrible fight in my own heart. So he is going to forge his own way. And in a letter to his very close friend Auerbach, he is the greatest, perhaps the only true philosopher actually now alive. And he's talking about Marx. Dr. Marx, that is the name of my idol, is still a very young man, about 24 at the most, and will strike the final death blow at medieval religion and politics. He combines philosophical depth with a most biting wit. Imagine Rousseau, Voltaire, Bach, Lessing, Heine and Hegel, not thrown together anyhow, but fused into a single personality, and you will have Dr. Marx. So certainly, he's extremely enamoured of Marx and his alternative way of thinking, radical way of thinking. The fascinating thing about Hess is we're going to see that his developments in a Zionistic direction do not in any way temper his enthusiasm for communism. So now, before we come to look at Rome and Jerusalem itself, the work that concerns us, because it's his writings which are relevant to our HaAtzmaut celebration, here's some background. And there's just a little here, a couple of pages, and I'm going to read this quite selectively. So Mayor Waxman was Hess's translator. I think in 1918, he published a translation of Rome and Jerusalem, which was published in German and into English. And he wrote an introduction which has some quite good interesting thoughts about Hess. So I've got to have a couple of selections here, but I'm going to read just one. Among the many notable Jews which the 19th century produced, who have profoundly influenced the course of events of the world in history in general, and of Jewry in particular, Moses Hess holds a prominent place. His services on behalf of the Jewish national movement, he having been the first to supply Jewish nationalism with a philosophical basis, undoubtedly entitled him to such a place. So Waxman, his translator, understands that although they were later Zionist writings, the idea that there is a philosophical basis to Zionism and the desire to return to the land, this he attributes to Hess, a pretty significant development in the path to the eventual creation of a state. But his original contribution to Jewish thought, his raising of the Jewish view to the dignity of a worldview, elevating to a much higher plane, Hess, like the prophets of old, was ahead of his times and saw dreams and visions in the distant future. And though his own generation did not manifest a proper appreciation of his ideas, meaning no one took much notice of him, Still, as time passed on, the seeds which he sowed have gradually borne fruit, and the Jewish national movement of which he was the prophet became a vital force in the life of world Jewry. The writings of Hess have attracted more and more attention. Remember, this is written around the end of the First World War. It is especially interesting at the present moment, when we are in the grip of a world war and are expecting events which may have a lasting effect on the future of Jews and Judaism. This is after the Balfour Declaration, to study the words of this thinker, to whom Judaism is more than a mere dogmatism and Jewish nationalism more than a striving toward the establishment of a petty political state, but both combined forming a mighty intellectual, spiritual and social force in the life of humanity in general, and Jewry in particular. Yet, with all his originality, Hess was after all a child of his time. And in his book Roman Jerusalem are mirrored all the different tendencies of the age, so that in order to grasp his full importance we must have a bird's eye view of all the currents, political and intellectual, which sway the general and Jewish life of that period. And I would recommend reading the rest of Waxman's introduction. Turning now to page 3, we have our first excerpt from Isaiah Berlin. Isaiah Berlin gave a lecture in the late 50s called The Life and Opinions of Moses Hess, which was published in the 70s against the current essays in the history of ideas, and I'm very grateful to Lord Wasserman for showing me this essay. Again, there's a lot to say. The piece is superb and it's worth reading its entirety. I have a number of excerpts here, but we can only read a few. Moses Hess was both a communist and a Zionist. He played a decisive role in the history of the first movement. He virtually invented the second. So Berlin subscribes to Waxman's approach that as a philosophical concept, he practically invents Zionism, even though he's not so well known today. Indeed, this remarkable fact is his chief, perhaps his sole claim to fame. Nevertheless, in the course of his troubled and dedicated life, Hess uttered some highly original and telling judgments that have not even now obtained the recognition that they seem to me to deserve. He was a prophet, again echoing Waxman, without much honour in his own generation, certainly none in his own country. Yet much of what he said was new, and as it has turned out, both important and true. But even if I am mistaken about this, the questions that Hess raised in the form in which he raised them are exceedingly live issues today, and have become, if anything, more critical than they were in his own lifetime. Berlin gives some background, and he offers a brief analysis of the sacred history of mankind, which I mentioned in the introduction. The sacred history of mankind, the next piece with an asterisk, found no readers, and is today deservedly forgotten. Great. It is of interest only because it shows that even in this early phase, Hess was a fully fledged socialist, indeed the earliest German socialist. Just a line in a paragraph that I have an asterisk at the bottom about his tense relationship with Marx and Engels. They mocked him so bitterly, they called him Rabbi Moses and Rabbi Hess and laughed his thesis to scorn. So he may have admired Marx, but Marx clearly did not admire him. Berlin also talks about the European Triarchy as an unreadable work. And a little more from Berlin now on page 4, just before section D. And still more violently, Jews are not a religious group but a separate nation. And this is critical to his thinking, as we're going to see shortly. He sees the Jews not in a religious, from a religious perspective, but as a national or racial group with all of the perhaps benefits and disadvantages and problems that description produces. And the modern Jew who denies this is not only an apostate, a religious renegade, but a traitor to his people, his tribe, his family. That's a citation from Hess. Racial chauvinism, nationalism in any form is condemned by Hess in the most passionate terms, then and later. But to deny one's nation or race is at least as repulsive as to proclaim its superior rights or powers. So he lives in an unusual space, and you can see here him trying to balance the notion of the right the Jews to return to their national ancient homeland with avoiding what he would call a coarse nationalism which conflicts with his communist beliefs. It was only in 1840, and this is, we'll mention briefly, 1840 was an infamous blood libel in Damascus, in which Moses Montefiore had been involved, and apparently a little like the experience that Herzl had over the Dreyfus affair many years later. It shook him and changed him profoundly and began a direction which produced the Roman Jerusalem. It was only in 1840, says Berlin, when the charge of ritual murder was made against the Jews in Damascus, that he himself suddenly realised where the truth lay. It dawned on me for the first time in the midst of my socialist activities that I belonged to my unfortunate, slandered, despised and dispersed people. And he goes on to say that he stifled his cry of pain because of the greater sufferings of the European proletariat, to which he thought that he ought to devote his life. Again, experience a conflict between the needs of the broad European working or underclass and the specific needs of his people, manifest in the conflict or perhaps his attempt to meld communism and Zionism. Now we come to section D, which is a significant section of the source sheet, which are excerpts from Roman Jerusalem. So I read the whole of Roman Jerusalem for this, and I recommend you read it. You can download it. I actually have it as a document. If you would like, I can send it to you. It's out of copyright, although I have a print copy. And it's written as a set of letters. And it begins using biblical tropes about this sort of widow, about the widowed city, which is a drawing on the trope from Eichel, the Book of Lamentations. And it's a series of letters, but they're just letters to a person. There's no response. And there are certain oddities about it. For example, he's absolutely convinced that Germany is the root of all anti-Semitism, but France will be the Jews' saviour, something which I suspect that the Dreyfus case may have disabused him of, but of course that was well after his death. He talks at great length about European countries and their role in their relationship with the Jews. That is not something which we're going to touch on very much. And inevitably, it's a 100-page long monograph. We can only touch on very small pieces because actually, I think, rather than reading sections, analysing it is probably more interesting. Anyway, we should see a few excerpts. This is in Waxman's 1918 translation. In the second letter, and I've picked out areas which demonstrate his conflict with his Jewish identity, his great admiration for his very pious grandfather, but his rejection of orthodoxy, which is only marginally less extreme, as we'll see, than his rejection of the alternative of the Reform movement, which he seems to like even less. In the second letter, we cannot understand a single word of the Holy Scriptures so long as we do not possess the point of view of the genius of the Jewish nation which produced these writings. And a lot of the work, as Berlin has alluded to, is about the national/racial identity of the Jewish people. Nothing is more foreign to the spirit of Judaism than the idea of the salvation of the individual, which according to the modern conception is the cornerstone of religion. Judaism has never drawn any line of separation between and the family and the nation and humanity as a whole, humanity and the cosmos, nor between creation and creator. This is very Spinozan. Judaism has no other dogma but the teaching of the unity. But this dogma is with Judaism not a mere fossilized and therefore barren belief, but a living, continually recreating principle of knowledge. Judaism is rooted in the love of the family, patriotism and nationalism are the flowers of its spirit, and the coming regenerated state of human society will be its ripe fruit. It's a particularist view of the world which he finds within Judaism, made kind of into a universal ethic with a national flavour. So it's Spinoza with a national kind of gloss, with a nationalist gloss. Judaism would have shared the fate of other religions which were fossilised through their dogmas and which will finally disappear through the conflict with science, had it not been for the fact that religious teachings are the product of life. Judaism is not a passive religion but an active life fact which has coalesced with the national consciences into one organic whole. This touches on the trope that he mentioned in his diary, where he feels that his Judaism is static and he wants to be an activist. It is primarily the expression of a nationality whose history for thousands of years coincides with the history of the development of humanity, and the Jews are a nation which, having once acted as the leaven of the social world, is destined to be resurrected with the rest of civilized nations. In the fourth letter, he speaks about his grandfather. My grandfather once showed me some olives and dates and remarked with beaming eyes, "These were raised in Eretz Yisrael." Everything that reminds the pious Jew of Palestine is as dear to him as the sacred relics of his ancestral house. It is customary that a bag containing earth from the Holy Land is put into the grave of every pious Jew. In this practice, however, as well as in the ritualistic use of the citron and palm branch, which, like the bag of earth, are imported from Palestine at great expense, there is something more than the mere carrying out of a religious precept or the prompting of superstitious belief. Again, he wants to universalise particularist practices. All feasts and fast days of the Jews, their deep piety and reverence for tradition, which almost apotheosises everything Hebraic, nay, even the entire Jewish cult, all have their origin in the patriotism of the Jewish nation. The Jewish reformers, who have emancipated themselves from Jewish nationality, and this is his main gripe with the reform movement. He believes it robs Judaism of what he regards as its central characteristic, a Jewish nationalism or Jewish nationality, understands this quite well. They're therefore very careful in expressing their heartfelt opinions, meaning they're careful what they say because their views may be unpopular. True, my dear friend, it is a fact which may even come to the attention of our German Jewish reformers that the Jewish religion is above all Jewish patriotism. I always recall with deep emotion the scenes that I lived through when a child in the house of my grandfather in Bonn, on the fast day commemorating the destruction of Jerusalem. On the first day of the month of Av, which is the first of the 9 days preceding the eventful day, the sorrow which had been manifested since the beginning of the 3 weeks assumed a more perceptible form. Even the Sabbath day lost its festive character during these days of national mourning and was named the Black Sabbath. That's Shabbos Chazoin, the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av. My pious grandfather was one of those revered scholars who, though not using the Torah as a means of subsistence, yet possessed the title and knowledge of a rabbi. Every evening at the close of his business day, he spent several hours in studying the Talmud and its commentaries. But in the 9 days, this study was interrupted. And instead, he read with his grandchildren the stories and legends concerning the exile of the Jews from Jerusalem. The tears fell upon the snow-white beard of the stern old man as he read those stories, and we children too would cry and sob. A little more of this in the 5th letter. Do I seriously believe in the redemption from exile? You ask this question. I also remind you that I've already expressed myself in 2 earlier works, The Sacred History of Humanity and the Triarchy of Europe, as a believer in the fulfillment of the Messianic hope. But it is not a religious version of the Mashiach concept. This is an idea of redemption, of return to land, of the salvation of the Jewish people with a universalist lens. You're certainly going far afield, esteemed friend, in holding me responsible not only for my present opinions, but also for those expressed long ago. Next paragraph, 20 years ago, when an absurd and false accusation against the Jews was imported into Europe from Damascus. It evoked in the hearts of the Jews a bitter feeling of agony. Then it dawned upon me for the first time in the midst of my socialist activities, and then we saw this citation already in Berlin, that I belonged to my unfortunate, slandered, despised and dispersed people, and already then, though I was greatly estranged from Judaism, I wanted to express my Jewish patriotic sentiment in a cry of anguish. And the last section in the asterisk section near the bottom of the page, the rigid forms of orthodoxy, the existence of which was justified before the century of rebirth, will naturally, through the productive power of the national idea and the historical cut, relax and become fertile. It is only with the national rebirth that the religious genius of the Jews, like the giant of legends touching Mother Earth, will be endowed with new strength and again be re-inspired with the prophetic spirit. No aspirant for enlightenment, not even a Mendelssohn, has so far succeeded in crushing the hard shell with which Rabbinism has encrusted Judaism without at the same time destroying the national idea in its innermost essence. So he sees a dilemma. So the dilemma is that he believes that rabbinic Judaism has become extraordinarily rigid. On the other hand, other attempts to break it have destroyed the entire being. And he believes that nationalism is a way to relax that rabbinic approach, but without destroying the core. And this kind of touches on the way he thinks that Judaism can be redirected or even kind of resurrected in a different form. In the 6th letter, and turning now onto the next page, I have just made an asterisk near the top of the page. But he talks here about his growing sense of Jewish identity and about what it meant to him to change his name. He was, of course, his Jewish name was Moshe, Moïse in the French, or he seemed to have gone as Moritz according to Berlin in his early life. And as a result of anti-Semitism, he made a decision And he's going to adopt, as you can see at the end of this paragraph, his Old Testament name, Moses. And I love this line, and it's very widely quoted. I regret exceedingly that my name is not Itzik. Like, I had even more Jewish that I could be Itzik, but his name was not Itzik. It was Moshe, and henceforth he is known as Moses for the rest of his life. In the 7th letter, the question you asked me, the answer to which constitutes the most difficult problem of 19th century Jewry, shows me that you've finally begun to interest yourself in Jewish affairs. Remember that he's writing to a notional person. It's a set of letters. You have then nothing against the attempt to raise the Jews once more to their former place in universal history, again universalism. But you believe that this aspiration is merely a desire, and that at present time world Jewry consists only of a number of scattered and dispersed Jewish families. But it is not a nation. The religious tie which till now has bound the scattered members together and united them into a single entity is now severed through the participation of Jews in the general cultural life. True, the reformers have tried to mend the situation, but they have succeeded only in widening the breach. And with barren orthodoxy and the uncritical reactionaries, those who still believe that the Polish fur cap, we call that a strimel, is a law given orally to Moses on Sinai and handed down by the sages, it is useless to argue. The efforts of our German Jewish religious reformers tended to the conversion of our national and humanitarian Judaism into a second Christianity, cut after a rationalistic pattern. So he's very, very critical of orthodoxy, but he's even more critical of the attempts of reform to address its limitations at a time when Christianity itself was already in a state of disintegration. So he says they decided to turn Judaism into Christianity at a time when Christianity was failing itself. Dissatisfied with reform and repulsed by the fanaticism of the orthodox and the heterodox, you ask me with which religious faction should one affiliate with his family in these days. I know only one religious fellowship, the old synagogue, which is fortunately still in existence, and I hope, exist till the national regeneration of world Jewry is accomplished. He sees the shul and the national life of the Jewish people as a way of keeping things running until such time that the national aspirations of the Jewish people can be realised in its homeland. I myself had a family. I think it should be if I myself, it's somewhat poorly redacted, would in spite of my dogmatic heterodoxy not only join an orthodox synagogue, but would also observe in my house all feast and fast days so as to keep alive in my heart and in the heart of my children the traditions of my people. If I had influence in the synagogue, I would endeavour to beautify the religious worship. Above all, I would see to it the scholarly Jewish teachers and preachers should assume their proper positions, be reverently respected. I'm willing to go with that. I would then turn my hand to other reforms, if you care to call them such, but of a different kind than those spiritless and empty reforms favoured by our religious reformers. No ancient custom or usage should be changed, no Hebrew prayer should be shortened or read in German translation, and finally no Sabbath or festival should be abolished or postponed to the Christian day of rest. The chazan and singers should not be mere soulless singing machines. He talks more about this in the 8th letter. I'm going to move forward to the 11th letter on page 7. Have you never read the words of the prophet Isaiah? Comfort ye, my people, saith your Lord. Speak ye comfortably to the hearts of Jerusalem, and cry unto that the appointed time has come, that her iniquity is pardoned, for she hath received, etc. And he begins quoting from the section near the book at the end of the book of Yeshaya, which is read on the Shabbos after Tisha B'Av, Shabbos Nachamu Ami. If you do not believe in these words, with which second Isaiah, this is in what's known to the academics as Deutero-Isaiah, after chapter 40, opened his prophecy, see Rabbi Hertz's essay on the back of the Hertz Chumash, as well as in words with which the prophet Avadia closed his prophecy. The conditions of our time are graphically pictured. The time is ready for the fulfillment of this prophecy, says Hess. This is the moment to return to the land. Was not help given to Zion in order to defend and establish the wild mountaineers there? Are not things being prepared there and roads levelled? And is not the road of civilization being built in the desert in the form of the Suez Canal works and the railroad which will connect Asia and Europe? They are not thinking at present of the restoration of our people. But you know the proverb, man proposes and God disposes. And then in the section from the 12th letter, which I'm not going to read, he talks again about the movement from the rigidity of orthodoxy into a new, vibrant national life in the land. So this is only a flavour of Hess, and you can see conflict with his religious identity, conflict with orthodoxy, conflict perhaps even a more stronger nature with the nascent reform movement, a kind of universalized version of a Jewish desire to return to the land, but the fulfillment of prophecy and the maintenance of those bits of Judaism that he finds agreeable. In the final section, I have some analysis from various writers, some of whom we've met already. But the first is an excerpt from Professor Ruth Weiss's book, If I'm Not For Myself, The Liberal Betrayal of the Jews. Ruth Weiss has a very brief discussion of Hess. It's not her primary topic. She's talking about communism. The ruin of Jewishness under communism was as complete as the ruin of Russia itself, but here emerges an apparent paradox. Communism and Zionism, two opposing ideological movements, had arisen at approximately the same time in modern history. Communism imposed its egalitarian internationalist rule on Russia in the name of an improved humankind. The various Zionist parties, sometimes acting in concert and sometimes not, consolidated a place of refuge for the Jewish people. Communism was credited even by some of its opponents for its noble ideals, while Zionism was denounced, even by some whom it rescued, as a reactionary movement of tribal narrow interests. This is in the context of her discussion of the portrayal, as she sees it, of those on the left, of the ideals of the Jewish people and its aspirations. As it turned out, Israel became the hospitable port of entry for fleeing victims of communist repression, which of course she's saying without any irony at all. And many non-Jewish relatives of Soviet Jews clamoured for exit visas to the Jewish state. Whereas communism shaped a society indescribably humiliating in mean, Zionism gave birth to the most generous and one of the freest countries on earth. To fly from Moscow, where Lenin is entombed, to Jerusalem, where Herzl lies buried, is to see in brilliant clarity the lopsided verdict of history on the debate that rocked so many Jewish circles at the start of his revolutionary century. Moses Hess had foreseen this inversion of aims and ends in his critique of Marxism and his formulation of the Zionists. Something's gone slightly wrong there. Jewish parochialism is always implicitly universal. Jewish law recognises both the legitimate existence of other peoples and the right of everyone who genuinely desires to become a Jew. By contrast, universalist idealism in religion and politics is always implicitly repressive, since it expects everyone to become its particular species of universalist. This is very interesting, because what she is saying, apart from the kind of very clever set of inversions that this piece indicates, is that he's saying that that in some ways Zionism was the flip side of the communism that Hess both bought into, but nonetheless had concerns with, because he foresaw that the Marxist ideal would eventually eliminate an individual identity rather than foster it. More from Berlin. Hess goes on to assert that nationality is real. Nations are a natural historical growth, like families, like physical types. To deny this is merely to falsify the facts and spring some unworthy motives of fear and cowardice. Next paragraph. What then are the Jews to do if they are not to remain sorry hypocrites or worthless non-entities among the nations? Hess affirms that Jews are made Palestinian patriots by their very religion, i.e. this desire for a national home is innate to Judaism. When his grandfather wept as he read to him Jeremiah's vision of Rachel in her tomb in Ramah, lamenting over her children as they were carried off before our eyes to the Babylonish captivity, when he showed him olives and dates, saying with shining eyes, these come from Eretz Yisrael, he was many miles from his native Rhineland, means in his mind. Jews buy Palestine earth, and we've seen this already. It's more than a superstition or a dogma, it's something innate. Nor is this solution to be found amongst those fanatical fundamentalists who, with their heads buried in the sand, denounce all science, all aspects of modern secular life. And again, he repeats these sections about what's going on the Suez Canal, about this is the moment where the Jews of the West are going to eventually have their opportunity. And although I'm not going to read it, I draw your attention to a section at the end of page 8, where he talks about Hasidism, and it's of particular interest, I think, to Berlin, who you will know came originally from a Chabad background. On the next page, we're still in Berlin, the first asterisk section, the language of Rome and Jerusalem after 100 years seems antiquated. The style is by turns sentimental, rhetorical, and at times merely flat. It's actually, I wouldn't say it's unreadable, but it's a very strange and rather disjointed work. There are a good many digressions and references to issues now totally forgotten, and yet it is a masterpiece. It lives because of its shining honesty, its fearlessness, the concreteness of its imagination, and the way it describes the Jewish people and its innate national identity is very powerful and very meaningful. I'd not read it before. And the reality of the problem that it reveals, the morbid condition that Hess seeks to diagnose and cure, has not vanished. On the contrary, it is as widespread now as in his day, but its symptoms are better known. Consequently, the book is, despite its lack of literary talent, not dated. He was a man who abandoned no belief unless he convinced himself by rational methods that it was false. His Zionism did not cause him to abandon socialism. He evidently felt no incompatibility between communist ideals and belief in a Jewish national risorgimento. Hess was not like Hegel or Marx, a historical thinker of genius who broke with previous tradition, perceived relationships hitherto unnoticed, or at least not clearly described, impose his vision on mankind and transform the categories in terms of which human beings think of their situation, their past and their destiny. Hess abandoned neither socialism nor Zionism because he saw no incompatibility between them. This is what makes him so unusual, so interesting, and so hard to understand. On the next page, all these ideas met, it may well be imagined, with an exceedingly hostile reception. Waxman alluded to the fact that he was not well received and perhaps had little impact in his own country. An exceedingly hostile reception among educated Jews, particularly those German liberal Jews against whom Hess's sharpest sallies were directed. Such words have certainly never before been addressed to them. That he was a man of limited education, a man who was now a communist, and was deeply critical of both the Orthodox and Reform communities in Germany, unlikely to win friends. As you can see, once again, Berlin refers to the fact that he was deeply unpopular with Marx and his circle as well. A little more from Waxman. Hess is not a systematic thinker. He never endeavoured to develop his view of the world and life on the basis of fixed principles and logical sequence, but presented them in a rather confused form. But nonetheless, as he said, Roman Jerusalem, in spite of its modest size, constitutes his magnum opus. In it we find a summary of his views on all grave questions in their most perfected forms. And it is really worth reading. This function of Israel, last paragraph of this section, which as a member of the great organism of society he is to perform, cannot be discharged anywhere else but in Palestine, where he will again be a nation possessing his own soil, a fundamental condition for living a regular, normal social life. The regeneration of Judaism and Jewry is impossible in exile where it lacks the soil, the basis of a political life, and where there exists constant fear of disintegration. It is, to some degree, a presaging of an HaAtzmaut type Zionism, rather than a Herzl Zionism. This is not Zionism per se to flee from persecution, to create a refuge, but to allow the full expression of national identity, although there are differences, and HaAtzmaut was not a communist. In exile, the Jews are unfruitful in all spheres, spiritually and economically. Jewish economic life, no matter how prosperous it may be in some countries, is abnormal. It lacks the basis, the soil. He believes that one has to have one's own land, one's space to be a proper nation. The Jews, therefore, cannot be creators and only middlemen. It is only in their own land where they will be able to produce new economic and social values that they will continue to develop their greatest creation, religion, which as a moral force will exert great influence upon humanity and thus bring about the realization of social harmony. Now, as we wind this to an end, I'm going to look at some excerpts from two more works, two biographies. One by Shlomo Avineri called Moses Hess, Prophet of Communism and Zionism, published about 40 years ago. The other, an academic work which we'll meet shortly. With the appearance in 1862 of Roman Jerusalem, Hess publicly became identified with a cause distinctly different from the political and social ideas of his radical career until then. To advocate the establishment of a Jewish Commonwealth in Palestine as a solution to the Jewish problem was in the mid-1860s very outlandish, even more so for a person identified throughout his life with revolutionary socialist ideas. You might wish to read some of the parts in between, but I'm skipping only to the asterisk sections. Like most of Hesse's books, Roman Jerusalem is poorly written. This is a universal theme. Everyone has acknowledged it's badly written. And its internal organisation is even worse than that of his other books. It might have been the haste in which the book was composed, as well as his rush to show off his learning in a subject, Jewish history, which was not, after all, the central concern of his thoughts for many years. The basic premise of Roman Jerusalem is founded on the assumption that the Jews are a nation, not merely a religious community. I think this is core. Avineri gets the core here. The liberal thought of the time, in attempting to grant to Jews equal civil and political rights and integrate them into general society, tended to play down the ethnic elements in traditional Judaism and focus on its religious ingredients. It is, if you like, a Spinoza. He takes the religious ideas and, as it were, universalizes them, if there is such a word, whereas he managed to evade the more parochial and ethnic elements. It was in the name of religious toleration and equality that Jews were granted emancipation. Jewish reformers, mainly in Germany, argue forcefully that since Jews were merely a religious group, nothing stood in the way of their being fully integrated into the German nation, its body politic. They were nothing else than Germans of the Mosaic faith, something which Hess rejects altogether. Roman Jerusalem is, to a large extent, premised on the conviction that this harmonistic vision is based in illusion. The idea that it's possible to harmonise a Jewish identity with a European identity, even post-emancipation, something which the Damascus blood libel of 1840 appeared to have directed him away from. Repeatedly, Hess maintained that anti-Jewish feelings had not abated with the disappearance of the ghetto, and the relatively successful integration of Jews into German society. On the contrary, in addition, Hess attacked the conventional wisdom of the liberal emancipation on a much more profound ground. It viewed Judaism as a mere religion, as an expression of personal conviction, overlooked the national and communitarian character of the Jewish experience, again touching on his communist ideals of a kind of universal experience. If the Jews were a nation, as Hess argued from the outset of the book, a solution which has religious tolerance as its goal cannot solve their existential problem. Now, skipping to our final source before a little wind up. Here's an academic work. It looks to me as though it was probably a reworking of a doctoral thesis, Moses Hess and Modern Jewish Identity by Ken Colton Fromm. I have not read this entire work, but it looks like it's got some good material. Like many Jews today, Hess walks cautiously toward a theory of Jewish religious identity that promises to harmonise the commitments of both Orthodox and Reformed traditions. So this is an interesting approach. My understanding was that he rejects both and wants to create something different. Colton Fromm seems to think that what Hess was trying to do was merge them into some new identity. Maybe there's not much to choose. He positions himself tenuously before the Orthodox defence of an oral tradition received from Sinai, and thus authoritative and divinely inspired, and the Reformed critique that these rabbinic texts reflect a history of interpretive innovations. Even as he appeals to a flexible oral law, the Reformed tradition, Hess recoils from the possible indeterminacy of interpretive license the Orthodox fear. He therefore seeks a reform still sensitive to ritual, custom, Hebrew language and the authority of rabbinic and medieval commentators, which is how he envisaged Jewish national life in his return. Yet Hess is not thoroughly successful. His critique of reform and orthodoxy is at times dismissive, callous and misdirected. His positive agenda for Jewish renewal is often far too sweeping and vague. He is clearly very light on details. He's a thinker, a visionary. There are inconsistencies. In fact, his life appears to be one great inconsistency. He's light on detail, yet there's something powerful and engaging about the way he writes about the need for a return to the land. Yet there are moments, and indeed moments, that will occupy a significant part of this study, that reveal Hess's genuine ambivalence towards the Jewish tradition in general and towards modern Jewish identity in particular, because he feels that Jewish identity has become something which is exilized. It's become part of a golos, what we call a golos mentality. It needs to be completely reworked. I think he's very keen on a modern Jewish identity, but he thinks the one he experiences is inauthentic. Historians of Zionism, in part, responding to the constricted Marxian picture, focused instead on the meaning of Hesse's return to Judaism. After a career of socialist and scientific works that covered some 20 years of literary production, Hess suddenly recovered the Judaism of his youth in Rome and Jerusalem. Zionist commentators were interested in what motivated Hess to defend a Jewish national revival. Was Rome and Jerusalem a radical departure from his early works, or the mature answer to earlier unsolved intellectual conflicts? Where the historians of socialism effaced Hesse's Jewish concerns, the historians of Zionism emphasised them, hoping to find in Hesse a forerunner to a movement that would begin almost 40 years after the publication of Rome and Jerusalem. That is, of course, what Berlin has done. Berlin describes Hess as practically the inventor of Zionism. What Colton from here wonders about is precisely the position of Berlin. The Zionism and socialist approaches, read together, promoted two influential interpretive schemes. Either we read Hess to illuminate Marxist thought, or we understand Hess through modern Zionist preoccupations with the Jewish return to the land, nation and authenticity. Zionist readings argue that Rome and Jerusalem is either a recovery and reworking of earlier strands of thought, and thus it incorporates earlier works within a more comprehensive Jewish vision, or a radically new work in its call for a Jewish state, and is therefore singular in its discussion of Jewish history. Socialist approaches maintain either that Rome and Jerusalem is a response to the socialist dilemmas of the 1840s, and is thereby a return to Hesse's socialist works of that period, i.e. a new form of socialism, or that the work is simply peripheral to the history of socialist thought, and thus not a return at all, and therefore they can ignore it. Again, he then discusses the Damascus affair, and I want to skip to the final paragraph on page 13 before the bibliography. Moses Hess is a conflicted and often tormented figure who defies exact categorization. I think that seems to be right from the little I know of him. Religious Zionist, socialist, philosopher, Jew, precisely because he feels the narrative pull of each. And in some ways it's very endearing, very human. He's pulled in different directions, as many of us are. He is so often disappointed. He's so excuse me. He's so often disappointed and angered friends, and still today confounds his interpreters, who look for the one category only to find that he fits so many others. But this is, to my mind, what makes his work so challenging and rewarding for contemporary Jewish thought. Only in Rome and Jerusalem and later pieces do we find other voices overtly and sometimes covertly threatening what once were secure and scientific claims. But those former commitments remain strong and defiant, resisting the displacement and authority of other narratives. They cannot be summarily resisted nor undermined by new portrayals of identity. Hesse's construction of identity in Rome and Jerusalem is a contested site that continuously endangers the integrity of the work as a whole. This is so because Hess himself is sensitive, however unconsciously, to the multiple threads that interweave and complicate modern Jewish identity. Rome and Jerusalem is a testimony to the complexity, pressures and disenchantment of the modern Jewish struggle for self-affirmation, which I think is a very good place to end. I very much enjoyed preparing this. I knew almost nothing about Moses Hess, only vaguely heard of him, to be honest. And the discovery is that, at least according to Isaiah Berlin, he was effectively the inventor of the concept of Zionism, at least as a political or cogent thought system, notwithstanding the fact that his own Jewish identity, a man who changes his name to Moses to be more Jewish, yet marries a Catholic, a man who is deeply critical of the encrusted orthodoxy that he refers to, yet is even more critical of its reform alternative, which is becoming regnant in Germany. A man who is a communist admirer of Marx, a Marx who treats him with contempt. A man who is able to take Jewish particularist ideas, ignore the more ethnic aspects, and turn them into a kind of Spinozan universalism. And yet, for all his conflicts and internal torment, as Colton Fromm says, seems to have set Zionism on a path, created ideas and thinking which, notwithstanding their conflicts and contradictions, are exciting, important, and probably as relevant as ever. Thank you.